Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to part 2 of the United States Transhumanist Party question and answer session today. Unfortunately, we lost our internet connection for part 1, and we're still having some technical difficulties, but we've started a new YouTube live stream. Please feel free to post questions to the chat once again, and we will endeavor to address them as readily as we can. We will try to update our Facebook postings as well to make sure people have access to the new Q&A. And we did have a comment on the old live stream. Is the live stream still going? It cut apparently. Well, that's why we're starting a new stream. Unfortunately, there are some repairs being done to the infrastructure in front of my house, and I think they interfered with the internet connection. But I believe when I was cut off, BJ, Scott, and Bobby, you were having a conversation on transgenderism. So if you would like to continue that conversation while we get more people in on this live stream, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I think we were just, when did we go out of feed there, Bobby? I believe it was when we were discussing how morphological freedom was in connection between transgenderism and transhumanism. But that was pretty much the as far as it goes in terms of where the two communities are bridged together.
Yes. So I think it's very important to recognize that over the course of the coming decades, as more augmentations become available, as ways to alter human biology become available, and to enhance human biology, to enhance human lifespans, we're going to see a massive increase in diversity. And this is where I believe these areas do intersect. We need to figure out a way of adequately dealing with and respecting diversity in existing societies if we're going to have a chance of adequately dealing with it in future societies.
Yes.
So I wonder, BJ, if you could give us some updates on the emerging technologies that you've been tracking and writing about recently.
Well, here lately, my focus has been on where mixed reality is taking us. That was something that I believe that we were discussing for the possible future book on transhumanism. My focus is on mixed reality because we are witnessing this sort of crash course or this collision course between the offline world and the online world. And the ramifications that will come from this is going to deeply transform how we interact with one another, how we interact with these intelligent systems. And that in and of itself is going to really push transhumanism forward in a big way, because it's going to be able to connect the entire planet. And at the same time, you can bring people from any section of the planet to you, or you can bring yourself to them, and it would almost seem, it would feel seamless, where the virtual is blended into the physical in such a way that you can't even tell the difference between the two anymore. So that's been my focus. And here recently, with the emerging of the AR kit, these are those, prepubescent steps in that general direction, where the popularity of augmenting our physical reality is becoming all the more popular. And with Apple and ARKit, that's going to drive in millions of more people that are interested in the idea. So it's going to be interesting to see where mixed reality takes us in the next 5 to 10 years.
I wonder, BJ, if you think there might be some issues, at least for some people, in seeing the difference. If they're very thoroughly immersed in virtual and mixed realities, will there come a time where some of them might, let's say, have a challenge distinguishing between what is the actual base physical world and what is an augmented version of it, or some sort of overlay that is so realistic, so persuasive, that they might mistake it for the physical reality that we inhabit.
There may be people who have an issue with it, and I believe that should be something that, as a transhumanist political party, we should definitely begin emphasizing on in terms of these emerging technologies are not just going to make an impact. They should make an impact based on, they should impact each individual to that own individual's discretion. However, to the extent that they would like technology to affect their own personal individual lives. Again, I strongly emphasize on morphological freedom here, which also includes the right of people to not be enhanced or augmented, which would include mixed reality and how it would affect their everyday lives. Then again, I also understand just how sweeping a lot of these technologies can be, where even though it is technically a choice between each individual, it's kind of hard to make the opposite choice. Where there's certainly a choice where you can have this modern 21st century lifestyle, or you can join the Amish. But then joining the Amish seems so radically different that a lot of people do not make that choice. And I believe that we're going to see the rise of the neo-Amish as a result of that as well. And it's going to be a difficult choice, but we have to really strongly emphasize that they should be choices for each individual.
Yes, absolutely. Freedom of individual choice needs to be respected at any stage of technological advancement. I wanted to notice that Martin van der Kroon has joined us finally. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are very pleased to have you. We have had a lot of technical difficulties with this question and answer session. I've had to start a separate live stream, but now all of us who explicitly planned to be here are here. And I would encourage everybody to go on Facebook. I've started posting links to the new live stream for this Q&A session. Please share that particular link so that others are able to join us as well. And we see AJ Davis says, it is back, hooray. Yes, hooray indeed. And Rich Lee says, I predict an increase in cases of PTSD caused by VR, virtual reality. And that relates to the discussion we had previously as to if virtual reality and augmented reality become quite advanced and very realistic, would some people have trouble distinguishing between the base physical reality that we inhabit and virtual or augmented elements thereof. So Rich Lee seems to think it might cause some issues even as severe as PTSD. And I'm going to open the floor for discussion on this. Martin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Regarding virtual reality and PTSD?
Yes, or other impacts by which people might have difficulties seeing a clear boundary between the virtual and augmented and the direct physical world that we experience today.
I think that is possible, much like it could happen with current video games that do not like virtual reality or augmented reality. But then we get more into the realm, I suppose, of like addictions, or people being so immersed within that virtual reality that they lose track of the actual reality. That is possible. It's so I don't think it would be particularly unique. It would just be a new version of people losing track of physical reality, as to describe it in such a manner. Could that be a problem? Of course, everything can be a problem. Do I think that that would be an enormous problem? I have no idea. I'm not an expert enough on like psychology to see whether that would be a serious problem for society or not.
Scott, what do you think about this question?
Sorry, I was fixing some of the technical difficulties here. I was trying to do some linkage, but the question was, again, it was about I remember you mentioning PTSD. Are we still on that?
Yes, and related issues. Essentially, how do people in the future draw a clear line between what is physical reality and what is virtual or augmented reality? Okay. How do they keep the distinction clear in their minds?
Right, right. That's definitely for me. I haven't gone too into depth with that, but I did I haven't had too much experience with VR, but when I did have my first VR experience, it was after a crash where my car rolled over. I actually participated in this little VR thing where I actually sat in a seat, and it was, you know, it was meant to keep you away from like texting while driving, and that really immersed me like a little bit too much, and it definitely freaked me out. But yeah, in terms of that, I would love to do more research on that. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say.
Yes. Bobby, do you have comments on this area?
Yeah, I remember Ray Kurzweil saying that it's hard to distinguish virtual reality from actual reality, and I think we've always been in a sort of virtual reality. We're kind of inescapable from it, right? We have all this information come in. You know, photons hit our retina, or pressure hits our tactile receptors, and it gets converted into electrical, chemical signals, and all these images you see in front of you, all the sensations. It's really a fabrication in your brain, and so I think it's always been a virtual reality, and you can quickly see that if you do some sort of psychoactive drug, or this virtual realm will definitely have some glitches, and but I don't think people really understand that very well. So I definitely see in the future there being a problem with people immersing themselves in the virtual realm, but I think eventually they'll be able to stay there indefinitely. I can see the virtual realm expanding, just be like massive, and you can just live there for however long you want to, and they'll create their own rights over there, and it'll be like a new sort of universe that you can like travel into. That'd be really exciting to see.
Now, on the other hand, there would still be physical prerequisites for survival that if you spend all your time, just like if today you spend all your time playing computer games, you may be immersed, and some computer games are quite immersive, but you still need to eat, you still need to sleep, you still need to be protected from physical danger, and in a certain respect you need to be aware of the outside world, the world that can directly affect your physical body here. So to some extent, one does need to have that skill set. If one goes into a virtual world, that's fine, and if one derives something valuable from it, that's fine, but ultimately one has to keep the physical in the back of one's mind and come back to it periodically. So let's see. We have various other comments here. Super Fin Guy says, unlikely. People would know they are in a game. And I do think most people would be able to draw the distinction or pay attention to the distinction, but we do have computer game addicts today as well, and I just think it's worth thinking about what proportion of people might experience those tendencies. Hybrid Intermediate says, thanks for coming back. Well, we're pleased to be back. And Hybrid Intermediate also says, this movement will happen with or without a central party or international social structure, thanks to those working toward organization. The biggest question I have is, how do we sell this as a popular movement without alienating the average people due to the, quote, extreme or unusual goals that we are striving for? And then furthermore, Hybrid Intermediate says, by average, I don't mean lesser, I mean those who don't spend time thinking about those advances. And I think, Bobby, you've mentioned this before, it's not just so-called average people, it's even academicians who are not quite aware of the emerging technologies, the research that is being done by people like Aubrey de Grey or Ray Kurzweil, who perhaps don't think about the implications of these technologies several decades down the road. So how do we reach the general public? in essence. And I welcome anybody's thoughts on this. Martin,
if I may, I think in part, so some of the ideas that are Constitution or the Bill of Rights that we find immigrants that help them to become members of our party with core deals. I think that's awesome. We think that far ahead. But yeah, to the common folk, I can imagine that they think like that is very far out there, and some of the other ideas might also seem very far-fetched. It's more because people don't look into the future that much. We can see this in politics, current day politics, for example. It's more reactive than proactive. But I think the way we could better connect to people is also show the things that affect them now, or more regular issues along the lines on healthcare, that we want people to have individual liberties and so on and so forth, and try to connect with them through there, and then further try to open them up to the ideas that, as was said, the average person are more out there, so to say. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think discussion and openness to new ideas is essential in cultivating that openness. The Transhumanist Bill of Rights is a great document for fostering that discussion, even if the other non-human sentient entities whose rights are being enumerated and advocated in that document may be decades away from being created or discovered. Still, starting the conversation now so that people are ready if and when those entities emerge is crucial. Does anybody else have thoughts on this?
We definitely have to be careful of how we articulate ourselves. I found like Zoltan Isfan or other transhumanists are very extreme with what they say. I think you really have to cater to how people think right now. And I found there to be a very large taboo against helping people live longer, and even to like 140, just like some people just like freak out when I talk to them about it. And most of the arguments seem pretty illogical and ageist. And you definitely have to like ease them into it and help them understand that it definitely seems like a daunting future, but the key is just making sure it works out, making sure that we transition well without with the least amount of problems as possible. And so I think it's quintessential that as many people know about it and contemplate about it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. BJ, do you have thoughts on this?
I do actually. With the question in particular being, how do we, what was this? Because how do we sell this as a popular movement without alienating the average people? This is an interesting question in and of itself, because it's a question that isn't just unique for us as a transhumanist party. It's unique for any type of political movement or cultural movement. And this was something that it was a big question that a lot of us who were activists and organizers had to learn really quick, because there was always that potential of alienating yourself from a mass group of people. And for a lot of us, it allowed us to create what within political circles was known as mass line organizing, which it served as a direct addressment to how you ensure you don't alienate yourself from groups of people. And that is when you are, say, in a city and you're organizing someone against, say, people are losing their homes, they're being kicked out of their homes from the banks because they're not able to afford the amount of money that is going into their homes. You do not go into this. You do not try to organize them with other political issues that are irrelevant to them. that are irrelevant to the issues that are affecting them as a community. And the same thing, whenever we are talking about transhumanism as a whole, we have to make sure that we're not talking about, say, VR, AR, or robots, whenever people are looking to transhumanism as a way of ensuring that they have shelter, that they have some type of transportation that they do not have to worry about in the near future, that they no longer have to worry about spending a great deal amount of money and a great deal amount of stress that goes into that situation. That's what transhumanism means to them. For others, transhumanism is going to mean something radically different. Everyone has their own different issues. And so whenever we address those communities, we have to operate based on what their grievances are. What do they see in the future? We have to listen to them as opposed to force them to listen to us. And that's what Massline Organizing was always about. You have to listen to what they see as transhumanism and organize them based on that. And with that, you'll create a popular movement out of it without specifically alienating people, which a lot of movements tend to have a tendency of doing, because for a lot of them, they want to just focus on the big picture, when a lot of people aren't looking at the big picture. They've got real concerns of their present day. And if we're going to create a future for them, we have to address those present day concerns. And if we don't, then we're going to alienate ourselves from them.
Now, what you mentioned is essentially targeted issue-specific advocacy for people who care about given issues or are personally affected by given issues. At the same time, though, transhumanism is quite an ecumenical movement, as I pointed out, and one of the strengths of transhumanist philosophy is precisely because it recognizes the interrelations among emerging technologies and the potential for a radically different world that these interrelations can create, even if individual technologies might only yield incremental improvements. Say if you combine prosthetics and biotechnology and nanotechnology and space travel and vertical farming and artificial intelligence and seasteading and a whole host of other technologies, how would that affect ordinary people's quality of life? So I wonder, and I understand some people care more about certain issues than about others, and it's important to speak to what they care about. But how does one also get them interested in those other areas and the broader connections and in the broader vision for which transhumanism stands?
Well, I think that is sort of a lot what like BJ argued for, is in the targeting issues that people face in real life. So on the old live stream, there was a question regarding LGBT. Let's take trans people, and their issue could be whether they've transitioned or not, but they may be passionate about it, on methods of making the transition smoother. So whether it's the reconstructive surgery part or anything before that or after that. And from there on, once they see like, hey, you are passionate about this issue, it becomes easier for them to recognize the value of other issues that they aren't specifically dealing with, but they can see that they can then understand better that other people might be grappling with those issues, and thus support them, be more supportive of the other issues that we have, and the bigger picture. Yeah, I think that would be a way to go, and to make, and I'm actually going to use Trump as an example here, which sounds funny, but when he went to, I forgot which state it was, where the coal miners are, and he spoke about creating jobs for coal miners. Whether he can actually pull that off is an entirely different issue, but that was a very specific issue that they were facing, that they're dealing with in everyday life, and it might not actually be salvageable to keep the whole coal industry going, but that's a different thing. They were passionate about it, and thus, because they felt that supporting them, they were willing to support him. And then they will more easily, the people will more easily follow other issues as well, such as, say, building a wall, or a travel ban, or, well, whichever other big issue is on there, or the new healthcare bill that they want to push. And whether that's good or not, it's entirely different, of course. Like, I'm not making any judgments on supporters of Trump, but just stating that this, using this example. And I think that's a way to go. Like, and it would make us look more human. Because I think a lot of people, and this is part of how we've been portrayed in the media, including by in the book on radicals in utopia, is that we are being portrayed as the people who want to turn everyone into cyborgs and preferably upload the brains into the cloud, and if at all possible on a space station. And that is, to a lot of people, not a particularly appealing thought. That sounds very sci-fi dystopian. A lot of people might envision Terminators running around. And yeah, I can imagine that people are not entirely on board with that. And as such, if we bring more of the earthly issues into the mix that people are grappling with, they will see, like, hey, they are not just indeed far out there, they are actually here with us too. There is a connect, instead of like these, yeah, they are trying to tackle potential issues in the future. I think that's going to be important, and yeah, I think that falls in line fairly well with what BJ said.
Yes, and I think you make some very good points, Martin. I think it's important to remedy this perception that transhumanists are just all about mind uploading, turning everybody into cyborgs, in particular destructive mind uploading, and that's not what transhumanism as a movement stands for. Now, some people may pursue those projects, and they may choose to augment their bodies, starting, say, with prosthetics or, say, artificial organs, but maybe eventually with more elective augmentations. But that will continue to be a choice that individuals will make. And some people will choose to be wholly biological. Some people will choose solely biological methods of enhancement, for instance, the proposed SENS rejuvenation therapies, and we will have a flourishing of diversity. Not everybody will be uploaded to the cloud. I think very few people will actually choose to be uploaded to the cloud. I have some philosophical concerns about whether that would preserve my identity, my I-ness, so I wouldn't do it. I would prefer to survive indefinitely as a biological organism, or as a biological organism with some mechanical replacement parts eventually, if biological parts wear out. Now, we have had just an abundance of questions now, so let's delve into them. First of all, AJ Davis responded to Super Thin Guy, who stated that people would know that they are in a game. AJ says that is true, but people can have natural reactions of fear to horror movies, so a thing even more immersive would likely have even greater effects, and that's a good point. Rich Lee on that subject states that stress-induced is more of a factor than being able to distinguish between two worlds. Drone pilots have PTSD, so the drone pilots that may be operating those drones may be dropping bombs on targets, and they might not know who the targets are or what the impact of their decisions is. But that seems to me to be PTSD arising out of a sense of unfavorable real-world ramifications of what one is doing. And then Super Thin Guy says, AJ, but not enough to cause PTSD. I think people don't think they are constantly in danger after watching a horror movie. And he says to Rich Lee, drone pilots are far away, but they engage in real war situations, which actually goes off of what I said. And hybrid intermediate, in relation to the discussion about how to relate to people, how to attract people to the transhumanist movement, says, excellent, thank you. We must proceed with caution. else we will be more ostracized than either the LGBT or atheist subgroups. Another concern I have is with the prevailing religious attitudes of our times. A number of Mormons are embracing our movement with open arms. Religious fundamentalists are an increasingly smaller but politically powerful group. How do we avoid having to do political, quote, battle with more fundamentalist religious powers? And shortly, I'll open up this question to discussion. I will state my view on this. I think it is great that there are Mormon transhumanists and Christian transhumanists and Buddhist transhumanists and even incipient groups of Islamic transhumanists, because we would rather have individuals of those religious persuasions be aligned with us and support our goals of embracing emerging technologies than interpret their theologies in a very rigid traditionalist manner so as to resist any advancements. And I am pleased that there are at least aspects of these religious denominations that are conducive to a welcoming attitude toward technological progress rather than one that rejects everything that is new. And I think this is also a historically contingent set of beliefs, in the sense that the Christianity of today is not the same as the Christianity of the 3rd century CE, and likewise Mormonism today is far from what Mormonism was when Joseph Smith founded it. And religions evolve. They will continue to evolve, and I think we need to have cordial communications with individuals who are religious to try to nudge them, at least incrementally, in the direction of accepting emerging technologies. So any of you who want to comment on this, please feel free.
I saw Martine Rothblatt talk about how she went to a lot of the major religions and asked them about her her project on harvesting genetically modified pigs for their organs, and she said all of them were in accordance with what she's doing, and we're okay with it. And
yes, that is encouraging. And Bill Andrews related a story to me as well. When he was traveling on an airplane, he was sitting next to a Catholic nun who was actually quite high-ranking in the hierarchy. And after he explained his life's work on telomere research and life extension, this Catholic nun essentially said that Bill Andrews was doing God's work in her mind. And this is precisely what God commanded, that you should try to heal the sick, that you should try to essentially help people who are suffering. And medicine, life extension, curing diseases will help people who are suffering. And it's interesting also, Aubrey de Grey along these lines, I think for sheer PR reasons, he tries to say, well, he's not directly working on life extension. Life extension is a side effect of his work. He's working on medicine. He's working on healing people. And that may be more appealing to a lot of individuals who may be more conventional in their outlook, but who still believe, for instance, in fighting cancer, fighting heart disease, fighting Alzheimer's disease. Any other thoughts on the question of how to perhaps respond to religious individuals or attract them to the transhumanist movement, or at least reach a kind of understanding where they won't oppose emerging technologies?
I do have certain thoughts on that, and that is whenever I've interacted with, like, say, the Christian Transhumanist Association, there was, of course, the somewhat unfortunate disconnect between Zoltan and the Christian Transhumanist. But, you know, to each their own, and I've been trying to strongly emphasize that what we are doing here now is to create this mass appeal to everyone, regardless of what their own individual beliefs are, and that if you believe in a God, that's fine. What we are trying to promote here is a better life here on Earth. And if you, whether you're religious or not, believe in these similar ideas, then you are most certainly welcome to be part of the movement. You're most certainly welcome to be part of the conversation. We are trying, you know, it's best that we look at transhumanism in the same way that Hank Pelletier was attempting to do for so many years, and that was create this humanitarian aspect, which is both secular and religious in many ways. And I think with that type of humanitarian measure under transhumanism, it would not only serve in creating bridge between the religious community and the non-religious community within transhumanism, but would also create a barrier against extremist views. And that seems to be the fear, regardless of whether it's a religious-based extremism or otherwise. It is the fear of extremism, and we shouldn't be afraid to discuss possible extremism popping up even within our own community. Extremism is not biased to any specific ideology. It can prop up in any type of movement. It can prop up here in the transhumanist movement, which is a problem and something that we'll have to address sometime later down the road. But creating a bridge between these communities is the best way of combating this, I believe.
I would agree with you. I think it's important, especially in movements that are primarily based online, to avoid the echo chamber phenomenon where there are a few people with strongly held views. My cat Newton is not among the people with strongly held views, but he is present. They are essentially reinforcing themselves in their extremism if they don't encounter countervailing viewpoints. That is why it's so important to have discussion and debate in a civilized and civil manner, and to be willing to engage people who have different ideas, whether they're left liberals or conservatives or libertarians or even populist Trump supporters. I think it's important to know what they actually believe, know what their actual arguments are, and if you disagree with them, respond to the specific arguments. Don't just characterize them as benighted or evil or uncouth or uncivilized, even though there is a lot of bad behavior that goes off on the internet because of these echo chambers and bubbles. And this is why I've tried to keep the Transhumanist Party very open and ecumenical, and irrespective of one's more mainstream political persuasions, as long as one has an interest in emerging technologies and aligns with something, anything within our platform, we welcome their input, and we would publish articles that speak to these areas. We would welcome project suggestions and contributions to discussions, so that nobody perceives transhumanism as a kind of exclusivist cult of a few essentially fringe thinkers. We are trying to broaden it considerably from that. Now, I wanted to also bring up a comment from A.J. Davis, who says, to dispel the taboo of anti-death in usual conversation, I found it quite useful to suggest that healthcare is going to continually improve, likely to the point of indefinite lifespan. And I think that's very important, because it's not going to be any one advance that all of a sudden renders people immortal or even indefinitely long-lived. It's going to be a series of incremental advances that gradually extend life expectancy, hopefully in time for us and those who are older than we are. But there's not a single panacea. There's not a single magic pill. Our life expectancies are longer than those of people in the early 20th century, and theirs were longer than those of people in the 19th century, and theirs were longer than those in the Middle Ages or in antiquity. And that dynamic is going to continue. And I think it's very important to convince people that the status quo, the possibilities of the present day, are not the outer boundary of what is possible. So then let's go on to some other comments. Michal Zimaka says, in response to hybrid intermediate, average people are using technology, smartphones, and newest health treatments. I think we should just expand on the benefits of that with smart arguments. So that reinforces my point. Most people are not complete Luddites or complete technophobes. I think it's important to convince them that the technological possibilities we're discussing are realistic, and perhaps focus on the more proximate possibilities, the ways in which they can help. So continuing on, Michal asks the question, what is the current structure in terms of members from the USA and affiliated from around the world? What steps will be taken by the party to increase those numbers? So as I've said, we have 521 members. I haven't tabulated the counts of US versus allied members. I would comfortably say the majority are United States members, but the unique aspect of the Transhumanist Party is we welcome anybody in the world even if they are not eligible to vote in the United States, as long as they're capable of holding political opinions and they align with our three very broadly phrased core ideals. And even if they don't, they're welcome to receive updates from us and participate in our discussions, again, because we want to be open to a variety of perspectives. With that being said, in terms of outreach, we are quite active on social media. We have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter account, and we like to converse with our members via formats like this Q&A session. Martin, our director of recruitment, will be able to tell us more about his efforts and how he has found the recent discussions and their effectiveness.
Yeah. So I think one of the first things I did before I was an officer, and that I emailed Gennady at one point, like, is there a place where we can actually discuss ideas? Because some people were commenting on individual posts that were posted on the website, and other people were making comments on Facebook via posts, and thus it became very difficult to have a more centralized discussion on whichever issues, just blank proposals. So that through that idea, Gennady instigated or started creating monthly discussion threads, which have been fairly active. I think it could be better, of course. It can always be better, but I think it's been very interesting to see how people discuss, and I've learned a lot. I will tell that I have, for example, no answer to BJ's comment on like that guns might be 3D printed, because I thought, like, I'm gonna take a shot at like how can we lower the number of people that are being killed through firearms without actually imposing or restricting people from having them. So that became a very interesting discussion, and I'm still thinking about it. And likewise, there are a few other people that discuss that. So that's the part, but that's the website. I think most right now is still going on Facebook, where we link to our articles, but also the number of comments that people post and the number of likes and followers. I think there, and I'm going to try to do that with various sort of experiments, quote unquote, a little more regularly, because Facebook feeds are loaded of everyone. If you have 100 people that you follow on Facebook, your stream is going to be almost continuous, and Facebook is actually going to filter some out. Likewise on Twitter, I'm trying to increase the amount of tweets we send out, which at the moment is not like a whole lot, like not how other people are almost tweeting 24 hours a day. That is, I suppose, mostly because I'm pretty sure that all of us don't want Twitter to become like a soap type thing, or however, like almost like a vlog of sorts, or a blog where people tell, I'm now eating a sandwich, or I don't think anyone would be interested in that from the party. But I'm trying to me away, because I know that on posting on Twitter, so this is a community effort of sorts that to increase that number so we get some more visibility. Likewise, when the UN had the resolution to ban nuclear weapons, I also reached out to the UN, as well as an article that reviewed radicals in Utopia from Reason magazine. I also reached out to Reason and thanked them for the fair review of that book and like the critical notes they made, from which I think we can also learn. Because, yeah, being critical of ourselves is also very important, in part to prevent like the echo chamber effect you just mentioned. So in that sense, I'm trying to reach out. I'm thinking of new ideas. I hope we can do more of these live Q&As, and just maybe in general even make videos. But I don't know, because yeah, that's also to each of us. Like, how will we do that? But everything is discussable. Also, if members have ideas, I am sure we are all open to such suggestions on how to improve our communications with y'all. That's part of, or large part we operate is in as democratic, in so English, in as much of a democratic way as possible. That's why members can propose blanks. That's why vote on them, and that we also accept if people write an article, like a guest article of sorts. That, yes, it has to be reviewed, of course, because that's something that's completely irrelevant to the whole movement, or it's so far removed from our standpoints. But yeah, like in that sense, but still, how can we improve that? I'm working on it, but I also invite every member, every person who has an idea on how we can do better, bring it.
Absolutely. And Martin, I would like to thank you for doing an excellent job thus far. You have kept our members engaged. You have facilitated some excellent conversations and discussion threads, and you have yourself contributed a lot of content to our website. So we are very active. We are prolific in terms of our publications. Now, one of the challenges that you brought up is a challenge that I think every one of us encounters on social media, which is how to get people's attention, given that everybody posts all the time now on Facebook and to a lesser extent on Google+, and a lot of people post on Twitter, and there are minor social networks as well, like Ello, which is a bit more oriented toward the arts, but you can have some decent exposure there as well. But there is this concept of the attention economy now, where the scarce element isn't even money, it's people's time and people's attention spans. And it almost seems like we have a problem with a kind of society-wide attention deficit disorder, for lack of a better term, where so many people don't have time to sit down for a few hours and seriously read something or consider something. They can glimpse at something for a few seconds. If they think it's nice or appealing in some way, they might like it, they might share it, but we want more deep engagement. And BJ, you're our director of social media, and of course you yourself are a famous transhumanist and author in your own right. So could you share with us perhaps some techniques or some advice or some things that we've already been doing right and some things we can improve on?
Over time, you've definitely hit the nail on the head, where our attention span has definitely shrunk in the last several years in terms of how do we engage people, and it's increasingly becoming short form based type of content that people are mostly resonate to, as opposed to this long form, deep engagement, which a lot of us in intellectual circles, we live for that type of stuff. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people do not go for those type of engagements anymore, which is unfortunate, but we have to go with the current of change as opposed to trying to fight against it. And that's where social media engagement comes in, where with social media, and that was what made Twitter so prolific in itself, was a lot of people were a little hesitant about the 140 character limitation, and yet over time we came to realize, wow, it actually really works. Just with those 140 characters, we can actually engage a lot of people in a short amount of period of time. But in order to pierce through that large barrier of this short attention span, my focus when I'm still working as a social media manager for Serious Wonder is I try to stay within the current trending line, which is great for Facebook because Facebook has its own trending bar, and there are various different sources you can rely on to find what is trending of that day or of that week. And it's best that for us to remain relevant and for us to reach out to a great number of people in this new method of engagement and short attention spans is we have to be part of that trending. We have to be reacting to those trending topics. Not all of them, of course. Some of them are absolutely ridiculous, and I have no idea why they're trending in the first place. But those that are important, especially in the political hemisphere, where we have our voices heard in that trending. And in order to do that, we also have to use other social media type tools like hashtags. As ridiculous as hashtags may seem, they help us get engagement, especially not so much in Facebook, but in social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram. Hashtags are very powerful tools in reaching out to a great deal of number of people. And we see those on Twitter. They have the trending hashtags, and it's best that we use those whenever we're using Twitter. And that might help us reach out to a great number of people, despite the fact that everyone has these short attention spans. Mm-hmm. Everyone does seem like they're suffering from ADD, but it's something that we're going to have to deal with. And I believe that with social media, we have the tools available for us to engage these people. We just need to learn how to better harness them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so one entity whom we seem to have engaged right now is my other cat, Beatrice, who has a scratching habit, which is why she is coned. But nonetheless, she seems to have been interested by your insights, BJ. Maybe she will become a social media follower of the Transhumanist Party sometime when she's uplifted. Which we don't know when will happen. But I think you give great advice and great recommendations, and we should strive to follow them in the coming months and years. Now, I want to also keep up with the discussion in the chat. Hybrid Intermediate responds to Michal by saying that he understands about the need to advocate for kind of incremental technological progress that people would be more familiar with, but he also says what most of us propose is much more alien than smartphone or computer use. And I think that's because we see the consequences of current developments in a longer term time frame than most people would. For instance, incremental medical advances could lead most people to live into their 120s or 150s in a few decades, especially if longevity escape velocity is attained. A.J. Davis mentions Elon Musk's neural lace as one of those emerging technologies that is seen as more radical, more out there. Hybrid Intermediate says, in my 4 decades, I have yet to see any movement more derided than the transsexual movement. I fear that we as transhumanists will face much more difficulty. Thank you for all the thoughts. We must be careful in how we present ourselves. And I think it's important to consider, if transhumanism becomes more famous, more well-known, what will the public's reaction be? Because right now, as Bobby pointed out, even some people in academia don't know what transhumanists stand for. We have a bit of an opening right now to shape that perception and to make sure that when the term transhumanist is used, it's not perceived as everybody should be turned into robots or mind uploaded or being forced to do things against their will, which is never what any transhumanist philosopher actually stood for, but rather a movement for more generally transcending the age-old harmful limitations of the human condition, like death, disease, suffering, poverty, war, human psychological failings, which almost everybody would recognize as being harmful or undesirable in some extent, unless they've just been so resigned to them as to be kind of trying to justify them in a fatalistic manner, like if you can't avoid it, make peace with it, which I think is where a lot of people are in their thinking. So then Lucas Di Moveo says, I don't think transhumanism is inevitable. Advanced technologies are as inevitable as a future volcanic eruption, but specific lines of tech happen because people want them to. transhumanists have to engage with what is happening now, and he mentions automation as an example of that. And Super Fin Guy describes this as perhaps reminiscent of Hollywood's take on transhumanism, like contingent, very disruptive technologies that change everything and may cause catastrophes. Of course, a lot of Hollywood films feature catastrophes or dystopias because that's what is more conducive to portraying cinematic conflict or a plot that is engaging to audiences, but that hopefully will not be how the future turns out. In any case, what do you think about this idea of technologies being fundamentally disruptive and unpredictable as compared to the other view of technologies being fundamentally incremental, where each little advance kind of creates a cascade and leads to a largely predictable, though radically different future? Which one of those views would you say is more accurate?
I think definitely with Amazon's ability to increase its marketplace globally has created a lot of issues for retail. You've seen, I mean, I've seen tons of malls that have been just turned into ghost towns. They really do look dystopian, really. I think that, it's not so much Hollywood, it is actually real life. It's just in places, we don't usually look. But I mean, malls, I even look at a mall that I'm near now, and it's near a very big city, and it's already starting. I'm already starting to see some of the traits that malls I've seen in smaller cities that have already turned dystopian. I'm already starting to see that in this mall. So I think, yeah, there is sometimes, yeah, definitely reality can be a lot stranger than fiction, a lot more extreme than fiction. And it's important to really just look at everything around you. Once we start getting used to to more like higher technology, we start to forget, we forget about a lot of things, and we don't really pay attention to everything around us. So it's easy to not really be able to tell that there are these big changes happening, because it's changing very slowly. It's like a frog in boiling water. It's pretty similar to Hollywood. A Hollywood movie would just be like a sped up version. They need to fit the narrative in there, in a 1.5 hour time period. Whereas, here this is real human years. So I would say, yeah, it's pretty similar to kind of like a dystopian type future. And I wanted to add on another thing to the discussion we had just a second ago about being able to reach out through social media and being able to create a bigger presence. Hashtags, definitely, while sometimes kind of comical, a little unprofessional, they do help. Memes are actually really big things nowadays. Being able to embrace comedy. When there's this short attention span, that's super important. You need to be able to entertain people and bring them in, but it's definitely hard to keep a balance in that. But it's really important that you can be able to relate to the cultures you're trying to relate to, and comedy, laughter, endorphins, everything. That's perfect. You need something like that. You need to be able to ride the wave and be able to just move like water, along with whatever type of funny memes there are. I've already thought of a few while you guys were talking about that. So maybe we can start a task force in that. But, yeah.
Absolutely. Please feel free to head up that effort and share your suggestions with us. I have been thinking of creating some accessible memes that convey kind of condensed but profound insights, which I think a lot of people will notice. I've noticed on Facebook, for instance, if one attaches a picture to a post, that post tends to become a lot more prominent than if the post solely consists of text. And having even, say, a quotation that's turned into a meme image with text could raise the profile of that particular post. Now, I wanted to move on briefly with the comments, because Hybrid Intermediate stated something in relation to our earlier discussion. saying we should do all we can to welcome all religions. And I agree, if somebody is sympathetic to our ideals, irrespective of what their worldview is, what their stances on other issues are, we can work with that person, we can have a dialogue with that person. Lucas Di Matteo says that he agrees. He also says, I don't think that we should take a transhuman future for granted. All and any progress can be stopped. I think this election is a great example of what happens when people get fed up. Super Fin Guy says, Lucas, I agree, the next middle age is always around the corner. And actually it reminds me of what Ronald Reagan said, that freedom is always one generation away from extinction, that essentially a lot of us, especially those of us who have studied history and who have seen the tremendous progress that humankind has made, especially over the past 3 centuries, tend to implicitly adopt what is commonly called a Whig theory of history, that there is a kind of long arc of progress and there may be frustrations and setbacks along the way, but generally the path is toward improvement. Unfortunately, that's not always what has happened throughout history. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire and the millennium-long decline of the Byzantine Empire are prominent examples of that. Ancient Greece had a dark age around 700, 800 BC, prior to the emergence of the great classical city-states. And likewise, you had a lot of Mesoamerican empires that rose and fell, the Mayans, for instance. You had Polynesian societies that colonized certain islands and had fairly sophisticated technology and a fairly advanced civilization, but because they were isolated from the rest of the world and they didn't develop sustainable means of resource extraction, eventually they ran out of resources and reverted to more primitive states or died out. So yes, progress is never inevitable, and a combination of social cataclysms could certainly derail it, as well as a kind of ossification of social structures. If governments become too repressive or restrictive or just too labyrinthine to navigate, or if private businesses lobby for special advantages that cut off routes for advancement for new upstarts, new competitors, or even new people trying to make their way into the middle class or into the group of wealthy individuals who have the resources to actually get something done in a society. Wars, especially wars that use weapons of mass destruction, could be terrible for the continued existence of humanity. But if there's a nuclear war and humanity survives, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a reversion to a kind of Middle Ages. There's a great novel from the late 1950s about that called A Canticle for Leibowitz, which I read many, many years ago, but I would recommend. It precisely articulates that premise, that a nuclear holocaust didn't completely destroy humanity, but it led to a reversion to a kind of early Middle Age society, and then it follows that society as it once again regains certain previously lost knowledge. So a very interesting book. I hope to avoid that scenario. Martin, you had something to say, I think.
Yeah, first a little bit backtracking on like welcoming other people, whether it's religious or people with a different set of ideas or ideologies. I think that is amazing. I would love to see feminists within our movement, so to say, MRAs, communists, socialists, capitalists, anarcho-capitalists. I don't really mind, in the sense that they bring their own perspectives, and regardless of whether we agree with those, that's something else. But they challenge us and they keep us on our toes, and that would prevent us from, perhaps stated earlier, from ending up in an echo chamber. Because yeah, that is also one of my fears. Not necessarily us, but that yeah, that a new group who has good intentions and so on and works on that, but yeah. Feminism or so you seem to have, but also on the alt-right now, they seem to be in a revolving door situation where yeah, they're only hearing their own voices and the media that supports their views, and thus, and yeah, they never really are challenged, with the exception of name calling back and forth.
Yes, absolutely.
on part of train of thought. What was the other point?
Well, the
You
idea
said,
that progress is not inevitable, and there are certain events, we might even call them existential risks, to use a common term in transhumanist circles, that could derail our advancement and set us back to an earlier era.
And yeah, to use a popular version, I forgot the author, but basically the author of the book, of the sci-fi novels of Metro 2033 that are set in Moscow, which I know really well, and I love the Moscow metro system, but that it devolves back into a barter system. In that case, they use bullets as a barter system because people need bullets against whatever is out there. But yeah, that it becomes more simplistic again. And yeah, that something like that could happen. Of course, I'm sure it's also possible that humanity will crawl back up and then probably move into an entirely different direction. But yeah, it is. I think that weapons, if nuclear weapons are going to be launched in the future, that is very well. That is a very possible outcome, that we end up in a sort of middle age again.
Yes, and I think you make a point that I think it forms a bridge to another comment that was made by Hybrid Intermediate. Would it be wise to somehow publicly enumerate the ethical concerns with our advancements, both as a way to invite conversation and to show the general population that we aren't just glibly working toward our goals? And I think we have done that within our Constitution with regard to existential risk and our view of technology. So for instance, Section 3 of our platform states the United States Transhumanist Party holds that the vast majority of technologies are beneficial to human well-being and should be enthusiastically advocated for and developed further. However, a minority of technologies could be detrimental to human well-being, and as such, their application, when it results in detrimental consequences, should be opposed. And we list weapons of mass destruction, mass surveillance systems, certain backscatter, full body scanners used in the airports in the US until 2013, or the deliberate engineering of new pathogens, which could create an existential risk. And in Section 4, we discuss the dire existential threat that nuclear weapons pose to sapient life on Earth, and how the Transhumanist Party advocates for complete nuclear disarmament, multilateral if possible, unilateral if necessary. And furthermore, we have, of course, our core ideal, number 3, states the Transhumanist Party supports efforts to use science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate various existential risks to the human species. And Section 23 of our platform states, the United States Transhumanist Party encourages every reasonable precaution to prevent existential risks that endanger sentient life. While some existential risks arise from certain technologies, many existential risks also stem from the unaltered so-called natural circumstances in which humans and other life forms find themselves. For both technological and natural existential risks, the strongest safeguards can be achieved through responsible development of protective technologies that empower rational and moral beings. I think this relates to Max Moore's proactionary principle, in the sense that, yes, the risks are all around us. Some of them are a result of new technologies, but many of them are a result of what humans are and have been since prehistory. The distribution of traits and dispositions among human beings hasn't very much changed since the Paleolithic era. It's just we find ourselves in different societies, in different economies, subject to different governmental structures, which alter and constrain our incentives. So fewer people are murderous today than they would have been in the Paleolithic era or even in the mid-20th century. But that's not because humanity biologically has changed in any radical fashion. And if the circumstances change again, unfortunately, human savagery can once again manifest itself to a much greater extent than it does today. And I do have some concerns with regard to especially world events in the past 2 years about whether we might be heading in that direction, and if so, what we can do to prevent it. But yeah, it's important to note we are not just glibly working on particular technologies or particular components of an agenda. We recognize the risks as well, and we try to pursue a balanced and a nuanced approach to remedying them. Sylvester Geltmeyer states, is there a way so that transhumanism can serve to counter or dispel various neo-tribalist thinking, such as religiocentrism, ethnocentrism, culturocentrism, etc.? And Super Fin Guy, to that comment responds, Sylvester, the way I see it, transhumanism is based on individualism, which goes against collectivism. And I think he sees religiocentrism, ethnocentrism, culture-centrism as forms of collectivism. I personally would agree with that. Lucas Di Moveo notes, our narrative isn't compelling. The alt-right's is. That is a problem. And this is responding to what Martin was saying regarding the alt-right, and also the problems within the alt-right, the echo chamber that kind of reinforces itself, unfortunately. Super Fin Guy believes the alt-right includes libertarianism. It's not just one narrative. Now, I have identified as a libertarian in various respects over time. I certainly do not identify as alt-right. I will say that. I am an ethical individualist, though more in the 18th century Adam Smith or John Locke sense, where I recognize that enlightened self-interest involves cooperation with others and respect for others' rights, and a broadening of the circle of sympathies so that one genuinely cares about other human beings and genuinely wants to help them, because that's also the best way to maximize one's own self-interest. But this is a set of comments that I think would be interesting to address, in the sense that, is transhumanism fundamentally individualistic? Can it, as Sylvester Geltmeyer pointed out, serve as a kind of bulwark against these tribalist tendencies, ethnocentrism, religious, nationalistic collectivism, which are very destructive and have led to millions of deaths throughout human history? Would anyone care to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to comment, if however briefly. I definitely understand and strongly emphasize in my own way of the emphasis of the individual in transhumanism. After all, morphological freedom, I believe, is probably one of the most important tenets of transhumanist thought. That is, the individual has the decision as to how far they go in this movement, how far they can become enhanced, and how far these changes affect them as an individual. However, I also understand the importance of collective social movements as well. And this idea that transhumanism should only be specifically individualist or should only be specifically collectivist, I find this to be problematic, because there are important roles for both within any kind of given movement. Individualism plays an important role in figuring out how individual people view these movements and how they would like those movements to help them as individuals in a individual society. But then collective movements also are important, because that emphasizes on greater and stronger groups of people, whether it's entire cities or nation states, what have you, especially for us as a transhumanist movement, where we are trying to reach out on these micronations that are popping up throughout the world. And I believe that goes more along the lines of both a collectivist and individualist perspective. It's individualist insofar as they are trying to individualize themselves away from whatever nations that they were originally conceived in, whereas it's collective in the sense that they're trying to bring about a group of a mass group of people together under a single ideal. And we should operate on both ideals, that it's not just individualist and it's not just collectivist. It is both, because both play important roles, and we cannot ignore one over the other, or else it'll be at our own detriment.
Yes.
I think to further to comment there on BJ, or yeah, tag along is that I think that the whole idea of everything or a lot of things being dichotomic, that is a big issue, because we see this in politics, especially the U.S. ones, because there's really only two major U.S. parties that people start to think is either this or that. Likewise, we get this when it comes to movements. So we see this, and we have seen this with the BLM, that some of those individuals within the group are saying that if you are not either of African American descent, that you have a darker skin tone, or that you are not, or that you are criticizing, you are thus against. Likewise, we see this on the alt-right. If you're not a Trump supporter, you must be a Clinton supporter, and so on and so forth. And I think that we fall somewhere in the middle, to be more a more centrist approach, as Dave Rubin would call it. Dave Rubin, for those who don't know, does the Rubin Report, and he has interviewed Zoltan Istvan before. Which this is actually the way how I got to know about the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Thanks, Dave.
Great.
Yeah, we take a more middle ground approach, I think, when it comes to between being thoughtful towards others and respectful, as well as saying, like, yeah, everyone still has their individual liberties. Because I think that is something that is being forgotten. It's either we have to regulate speech, or we have to say everything because there is freedom of speech. But that's not necessarily the case. That you have the right to freedom of speech doesn't mean you necessarily have to use that right at any given time. It's like you have the right to vote, but you don't have to vote.
Right. I can choose to abstain from saying anything. Yes. I agree with you, Martin, that essentially the Transhumanist Party can be characterized as centrist when it comes to a lot of the dichotomies, especially in American politics. Indeed, when Zoltan asked me to take on the chairman role, he did say to me he would like to see the Transhumanist Party run in a centrist and small d democratic manner, and I hope I've tried to do that by essentially not lurching to one mainstream political set of positions or the other. I myself have been very skeptical of both the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States, because I think they try to sell package deals to the American public, where there is an array of issues. They're not logically related to one another. They're just cobbled together from a coalition of special interests and donors that happen to be aligned with those parties at a given time. And each party tries to get the alignment of approximately half of the politically active population. But it's not a principled kind of alignment, and a reasonable person will almost always agree with some of the ideas advocated by one of the major political parties while disagreeing with others. So I wanted also to use this opportunity to look at some of our viewer comments along these lines. For instance, Lucas Di Moveo says that what he's getting at is tribal movements are becoming popular again. And Super Fin Guy says, at the same time, collectivism and blind belief is being exposed. For example, take the recent CNN scandal. And then I will also, just as an aside, because we can continue the discussion on collectivism, echo Super Fin Guy's statement that cats need to be made sentient. And Bobby, you said, I wonder if people will want their pets to live forever. I want my pets to live forever. I don't know if technology will advance far enough to make that possible, but a lot of people have had their cats and dogs cryopreserved in that hope.
There was actually one, Carla M. Parsons, I believe you know her, Gennady, where she wanted to clone her cat. She had that campaign that she was wanting to do. Though I think, unfortunately, they had some big flood that happened that prevented them from completing their campaign. But that was something they were taken very seriously, and we're actually seeing a number of people wanting to clone their pets as a sort of a, not necessarily to longevitize their pets' lives, but it's a step in that general direction, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. So now, with regard to the question of populist movements being on the rise, but then also perhaps being discredited, we've of course seen the Brexit vote in 2016 and then the election of Donald Trump as being very emblematic of the rise of populist movements. But since that time, we've had elections in Austria, the Netherlands, France, which were defeats for the populist movements. And perhaps there is now a kind of reemergence of balance or sanity, or am I just being wishful in my characterization? I welcome any input on that.
Hopefully. Hopefully. Well, let me just say something on that real quick, and I'll let everyone else give their opinion. But I've noticed the same thing. It seemed a bit dire at first with Donald Trump becoming elected, and before then it was the Brexit vote. It just felt like that we were moving in a much more what's the term for it? We were trying to break away from any type of multipolar world that we were building for the last couple of decades now, and it seemed that everyone wanted to go their own individual way, which is problematic because that it creates a somewhat chaotic environment for nation states. What we need is peaceful public relations between country to country, and without that, it's only going to create more chaos within the general region, whether it's the United States or the United Kingdom or elsewhere. And with all these other individual states making a sort of resistance movement out of this, I'm hoping that things are going in a more general, more peaceful and collective general direction in that regard, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I hope so too. I think probably politically in the near term, the best we can hope for is some mix of balanced centrists and positions of power and gridlock for those who aren't balanced centrists. Like I do think institutions in the United States, particularly the judicial branch, are checking some of the greatest depredations of the Trump administration. His original travel ban was evidently unconstitutional, ex post facto, and just brutal to peaceful, innocent individuals. The revised travel ban is inconvenient, and it does keep out, in my view, a lot of worthy individuals and peaceful individuals from entering the United States. But it has nowhere near that edge of just brutal abuse that the original travel ban had. And I think
it recently affected that that robotics group, the all-female robotics group from Afghanistan, in fact.
Yes, and that's regrettable, of course, because those are exactly the people we want to become more prominent in Afghan society, or if they can't, because that society is very repressive still, to escape to the West and practice their craft here. I wanted to continue on with some of the comments. Now, we are past 1 p.m. Pacific time, but because we had this interruption, I hope we can stay on for maybe another 20 minutes to half an hour if you're all agreeable to that, so that we can get in a full 2 hours of commentary. There was a brief discussion about science perhaps having the same problem of public appeal and getting people to understand it. Hybrid Intermediate says, I know of no solution to the problem. Lucas Dimoveo says, neither do I. I wonder what the effect of a possible small Mars colony established by Elon Musk will be. I'd be more inclined to leave than to persuade 9 billion people. Lucas Dimoveo says, I believe that was the same comment about tribalism. Now, I do think in terms of the ability of the public to be receptive to science, there have been different periods of time where the receptiveness varied. For instance, in the 1960s, actually, there was a lot of enthusiasm for science in the United States, and part of that was fueled by the space race, by the very prominent achievements of both the United States and the Soviet Union, and this idea that science was somehow a part of national greatness. And for all of my issues with early to mid 20th century collectivist policies in the United States, say from Herbert Hoover or Franklin Roosevelt, they built some good infrastructure. They built some good hydroelectric dams. They built power plants. Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. At least he began with that. And even Trump right now is talking about revitalizing infrastructure, though how he will achieve that is still in question, and whether it will be at all successful or whether it will be a massive boondoggle is still in question. However, when there is this tangible connection between science and large-scale visible accomplishments that move the human species forward, I think that gets people more excited. Elon Musk is getting people excited with the Tesla electric vehicles, with SpaceX, with his plans for Mars colonization, to a lesser extent with Solar City, Hyperloop, Neural Lace. So what do you think about promoting excitement in and interest regarding science? Bobby, I wonder if you might have some ideas, since you've written on the scientific method and its importance.
Yeah, I definitely find that to be a quintessential dynamic to transhumanism, our society in general. I think it's really important for political leaders to be more scientifically literate. And are they allowed to disagree with uncontroversial scientific results? And I really don't think they are. They're not allowed to disagree with like the laws of gravity or the climate crisis, just because they find like a few scientists who claim otherwise. That's not really how science works. It requires evidence, and I think that's just a massive problem that we're going to have to deal with. Having to convince, or vaccines is another example. Having to convince the public and our politicians of being in congruence, their political agenda being in congruence with science.
Yes, and we had that conversation at some length when I interviewed you last week, Bobby. I do think it would be impractical, at the very least, and undesirable from a more libertarian perspective, to silence any politician who expresses unscientific or pseudoscientific views. Nonetheless, in the court of public opinion, there should be more of a reaction when that happens. And I think that's one of the benefits of spreading scientific literacy, of getting people to understand. Vaccines have saved millions of lives, and the people who refuse to vaccinate their children, they're not just making that choice to expose their children to harm, they're also exposing to harm those who cannot, for legitimate health reasons, be vaccinated. They're also reducing the herd immunity that prevents certain eradicable diseases like measles or whooping cough from spreading. Measles and whooping cough have killed people now in the Western world, which is terribly tragic. Now, with regard to essentially enthusiasm for science, I think it's very important, in a sense, to give people an understanding these ideas have consequences, and they have good consequences if they are pursued consistently. I wanted to bring up a question here from Michael J., who says, I'm not very familiar with your party, though I've seen a few of Mr. Stolyarov's videos explaining your platform. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about your movement? And I can speak to that briefly, and then I'll open it up to you. I have an article, actually, from early 2013 regarding common misconceptions about transhumanism. For me, the biggest misconception is that transhumanists want to turn everybody into the Borg from Star Trek, that everybody will be assimilated into this big technological assemblage. And that's not at all what transhumanism stands for. Another misconception is transhumanists want to force everyone to embrace emerging technologies. And again, that's not the case. We are likely going to have a spectrum of people who choose to embrace various kinds of technologies and not others. Another misconception, in particular with regard to life extension, there is a series of misconceptions. One, that life extension will keep you old and frail forever. That's not possible, actually, medically, because it's being senescent and frail that increases one's exposure to disease and various other risks of death. Another misconception about life extension is, oh, indefinite lifespans will be boring. Well, no, because there's so much activity, so much creation, so much possible consumption that you'll never run out of things to pursue. Another big misconception is the overpopulation argument, in my view, because it stems from a kind of Malthusian idea that resources are very rigidly limited and very finite, and if population grows, especially if population grows exponentially, we'll necessarily run out of resources. There are several problems with that. First of all, resources are a function of the human mind, which, as Julian Simon pointed out, is the ultimate resource. And the human mind finds ways to use new raw stuff in a more effective manner. Oil used to be a waste product, for instance. And now there's emerging potential for a lot more arable land due to vertical farming, renewable energy of various sorts. So even as population grows, it's perfectly conceivable that we would be able to grow our resource base at all times to not just compensate for the additional resource expenditure, but to raise the average standard of living. And of course, the other matter that is very important is birth rates. Birth rates affect population growth far more than death rates. And as industrialization and prosperity in general have advanced, birth rates everywhere in the world have declined. It's just in the so-called developing world, they were higher to begin with. So we're still seeing in some countries 4 to 5 children per family, but that's down from maybe 7 or 8 or 10 in prior eras. So the population growth rate may stabilize by itself. But even if everybody were to become immortal tomorrow, some demographers have stated, well, that would just replicate the effect of the baby boom in the 1950s and 1960s, or not even do that. So those are some common misconceptions that I have encountered. But if there are others that you'd like to address, please feel free.
Well, I think that when it comes to, yeah, there's even if there is a possibility of overpopulation due to increased longevity, and indeed, I agree that the more a country prospers and the more well-educated the population is, based on the data, it seems to show that then the number of children a family has declined. For example, then in Japan, over the past few decades, birth rates have been they have been under death rates, hence the population is declining, and they actually at this point see that as a problem, obviously, because well, the longevity isn't increasing very much yet. I mean, it's pretty decent what we actually achieved through the 20th century, but it's not in the ranges of adding 20 years or something. But even if we were to see an overpopulation problem extending, then by that time, because it's not going to happen in 3 years, most likely, then we might actually be able to colonize Mars. Mm-hmm. So what is stopping us from basically having people who want to then move to a different planet and we extend there? Mm-hmm. And in that sense, we will not have the Earth as much. For example, with half the population on Earth because the other half is living on another planet, we suddenly have no overpopulation problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think it's important to keep in mind we can colonize other areas, be it another planet or say the ocean floor or the ocean surface via seasteads. There's a lot of uninhabited land, especially if one drives through the western half of the United States, one will see so much of it is just completely barren. A lot of it is owned by the federal government. Actually, Zoltan had an idea of funding a universal basic income through leasing out federally owned land for productive purposes, and then using the proceeds essentially to give everybody an unconditional floor to their standard of living. But I would completely agree that the confluence of future emerging technologies, some of which we cannot predict, is going to lead to a situation where what we see today as a dire problem in certain parts of the world with regard to resource scarcities may be overcome in ways we wouldn't even be able to conceive of today. And Aubrey de Grey points this out when he's encountered with the overpopulation argument. He says essentially that what the people who make this argument assume is life extension is going to increase and these rejuvenation therapies are going to be made available, but everything else is going to stay the same. And of course, that's never going to be the case. Technologies will advance in parallel. And it's interesting also, Emil Holst asked the same question. What are the biggest misconceptions about the core tenets of transhumanism according to you? Bobby already responded, saying, I think the inability to grasp the frontier science that transhumanism is, and I find people very pessimistic about how our future can even work out. They think it is inevitably destructible. So Bobby, could you expand on those remarks, perhaps, because they're relevant to the question about common misconceptions?
Yeah, I just constantly find people extremely pessimistic, like just about everyone I talk to about it. But there are some like plausible arguments with like overpopulation, and a big one is they think some like dictator will have this power. But it seems like scientists are doing really well at preventing this gap of rich people gaining the technology first. I see Liz Parrish and Bill Andrews and Aubrey de Grey and other scientists talk about they're trying to get their therapies and rejuvenation technology out at a very low price. So that seems very optimistic, and I really can't see. This is so popular. You could find this. It's not like a secret. This people living indefinitely, and so I can't see them like keeping this technology from us. It'd be too much of an uproar.
And I think history shows that every time a technology is developed, it never remains the exclusive preserve of a wealthy elite. See what happened to cars and computers and cell phones and airplane flights. And yes, the wealthy may have higher quality goods of a particular type. There are still luxury cars today, but in terms of getting the basic functionality of that good, that tends to be democratized fairly quickly and at an accelerating rate with newer technologies, say smartphones as compared to prior technologies. It took about half a century for since the discovery of the light bulb for electric light bulbs to be commonplace throughout people's homes. And now the pace of adoption is a lot quicker. So I wanted to go to a different topic because I think this is important. Open Source Temple asks, what is the Transhumanist Party's stance on Russia developing autonomous targeting capabilities currently? And AJ Davis says, if we can manage to argue that the targeting systems are sentient, then we might be able to have the UN force Russia to give them rights. And probably the sentience is several decades away, though. Lucas Di Matteo notes, we should keep the truth of the political landscape in mind. We're not in the position to force anyone to do anything. Along these lines, because we're talking about foreign policy, especially with another nuclear power, there is always the risk of nuclear war. So I'll mention comments by Open Source Temple, who says, I don't think a nuclear war would send us back to the Middle Ages. It would be extinction, you know, like with climate change. Another thing people constantly underestimate. And Open Source Temple also says to AJ Davis, they, meaning the Russian government, are targeting neural networks. They are nowhere near complex enough to be sentient, exactly what I said earlier. Neural networks used for targeting and firing weapons. A.J. Davis says it was a joke, the limitations of text. So I want to comment on that whole nexus of questions. First of all, as I mentioned before, nuclear war is one of the most salient existential risks that we face today. All other challenges in terms of foreign policy, in my view, pale by comparison, and I think the Transhumanist Party platform supports that. So with regard to any other nuclear power, the primary priority should be avoid escalation, reduce the risk of a nuclear confrontation to the extent possible. I have been a strong critic of both Vladimir Putin's regime, which is authoritarian and repressive, and United States foreign policy that interferes in Eastern Europe, because I do not see the US as having a compelling strategic interest in Ukraine or even in the Baltic states, notwithstanding their membership in NATO. And that's not to say that I want to see those countries annexed to Putin's Russia. I don't. I just think that to risk an escalation, even a conventional war that is brutal, but especially a nuclear war that could cause the extinction of humanity, for the sake of those geopolitical interests that don't directly relate to the well-being of Americans, or most Europeans, I would say, would be foolhardy. And it is the outcome of a kind of aggressive set of geopolitical ambitions where the United States administrations, and this was the case under Obama, it would have been the case under Hillary Clinton. I wonder how much would be different under Donald Trump, if anything. The United States administrations don't seem to be willing to back down in a conflict out of perhaps a sense of pride, but that sense of pride can lead to lost human lives. And that, to me, is an unacceptable cost for nominal geopolitical victory. So I will say that as my general perspective. Now, with regard to autonomous targeting systems, I think it's a terrible risk right now when an autonomous targeting system is paired, say, with nuclear weapons or even conventional large-scale destructive missiles, because the programming is still in its infancy right now. You've had, of course, human drone operators making errors, but we've seen the kinds of narrow AI systems that are out there. Even IBM's Watson, although it allows for some diagnostic improvements over clinicians in certain cases, it can still make some rather absurd recommendations, or we've seen some of its Jeopardy answers that were off target. So just because the systems are there doesn't mean they're going to be 100% perfect. And the question we should ask is, what are the ramifications of a mistake? If it's getting the wrong Jeopardy answer or even getting the wrong medical diagnosis, but in a situation where you have a human clinician who can countermand it, that could be fine. But if the consequence is somebody's death or the deaths of large numbers of people, we have to be extremely careful and extremely cautious. And I would not support any sort of autonomous weapons systems at this time from any side. I think the proper venue, of course, the United States cannot force Russia to do anything and should not try to force Russia to do anything. But organizations like the United Nations, or even through bilateral diplomacy, trying to agree to restrict the use of those systems, just like civilized powers have agreed to essentially eliminate the use of chemical and biological weapons in the early 20th century. That same type of understanding needs to occur right now. As long as we don't have sentient AGIs controlling the weapons targeting systems, we should not risk some still dumb, in an objective sense, narrow AI algorithm making that decision about who lives and who dies. So that is my commentary, but I'm wondering what your opinions are on this.
When it comes to Russia, I think the one thing that we do need to discuss is their increasing ability to use cyber warfare as their predominant means of targeting nation states of which they disagree with. Whether it's Ukraine, they've attacked their entire power grid just by hacking. Here recently, there was an interesting attack that happened in the Black Sea where there was several different ships that were suffering from what appeared to be GPS spoofing. And that we're not sure if that's actually Russia, but there is a pretty good likelihood that it was Russia. And that only increases the fact that Russia is putting in a lot of effort in pushing cyber warfare as being the predominant means of warfare, as opposed to boots on the ground or chemical warfares or nuclear warheads or automated drone systems. The big problem that we're going to be facing is cyber warfare. And whether, regardless of what your opinion is on the whole debacle of Russia here in the United States and whether or not Russia targeted our electronic voting systems, just the fact that we're even having that discussion tells us that there is something fundamentally different about war today than it was in the 20th century. We're focused on these old primitive 20th century type weapons, but cyber warfare is the real deal breaker here. And Russia is going headfirst in terms of embracing these technologies. They are embracing hacktivists. They are embracing being able to target someone's entire socioeconomic foundation and pull it from them without them even realizing it. And that can be potentially more destructive than a nuclear weapon, because in a nuclear weapon, although destructive in terms of human casualty lives, it still has a range of destruction depending on the size of the nuclear weapon. But when it comes to cyber warfare, you could potentially collapse entire socioeconomic foundations at a countrywide scale, even in countries as large as that of the United States. So we definitely have to emphasize what we as a party would address and what other parties would want to address in terms of cyber warfare, and how we would address countries like Russia who are fully embracing this future of warfare.
And those are interesting points, and I do think there is an increased threat of cyber infiltration, cyber espionage, disinformation spread through online channels, especially concerted campaigns of disinformation. On the other hand, it seems to me, for all of the potential damage that cyber warfare can do, it is a lot more genteel than conventional warfare, in the sense that, yes, you could be misinformed, your systems could be hacked, your information could be stolen, even some of your critical infrastructure could be damaged. At the end of it, though, you still have a chance to survive, according to whatever means are available to you. Whereas that is not the same when a bomb gets dropped on you, or when you get shot, or when there is a nuclear, chemical, or biological holocaust. So in that sense, I would say the shift to cyber warfare is actually progress. It's actually an example of how technology may ameliorate some of the most blatant consequences of war. Now, that being said, we wouldn't want our power grid disabled. We wouldn't want to have our water systems or natural gas systems or any...
Or nuclear.
Right.
Or nuclear. The Stuxnet virus that was created by the U.S. and Israel that targeted Iran's nuclear facility. And
it got out of control. It couldn't be limited to Iran. It essentially spread throughout personal computers. And that's the danger of creating aggressive tools of cyber warfare. I think cyber defense is important and crucial. Redundancy in systems, so that if one node is damaged, others can still keep functioning, is crucial. Security for personal information, encryption, are extremely important. We don't have an official platform plank about cybersecurity or cyber warfare, but I agree with you, BJ, it's definitely worth contemplating. Now, I wanted to ask anyone else for input for about a few minutes, and then we should move on to some other questions as well.
Well, I think at this point in time, Russia does use some tactics on cyber warfare that is basically in an aggressive stance. But I think what they see the value in cyber warfare, using online means, is it's more derived from what the Russians called mashkirovka.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I think the most acceptable translation to English, because there's no straight translation, would be little deception. It's a tactic that the Russians and Soviets have used throughout history to try and mislead and misinform enemies, and I think that is something they would rather be doing to keep the supposed enemies off their trail, or to misdirect them, mislead them, and through misinformation, as opposed to an outright attack. Because they'd rather have the opponent scrambling, not knowing what to do, as opposed to them actually knowing what to do, because they see the value in of a confused enemy over a directly defending enemy. And I think that's part of why, in Russian circles, they're like, well, this is really good. This really works well with this vision of how to engage or do the more subtle versions of warfare. And yeah, maybe we should, like, as a country, so to say, in order to be able to counter this, embrace the Russian Mashkirovka, in a sense, that we develop more tools in that sense rather than to outright take down stuff.
Yes, and I wonder to what extent that would save lives because people are confused and they don't know how to respond, or to what extent that would render us vulnerable to greatly misunderstanding some action, taking it out of proportion, and perhaps launching a preemptive attack that is very destructive. So, of course, there have been confusions during the Cold War era and near misses where one side nearly launched a nuclear attack because of a mistaken radar signal, or somebody thought the other side was launching missiles, and only because cooler heads prevailed was that averted. Either Scott or Bobby, do you have any further comments on this?
Yeah, definitely with the U.S., we have to watch out, what our own government performs on us, and in terms of like cyber attacks, I think the ability for them to be able to surveil the mass public is already a cyber attack on our human rights. And I think that might be like one of the biggest challenges right now is trying to reform that, and definitely dealing with Russia and China as they're definitely developing those.
Okay, so
isn't it called surveillance versus surveillance?
Yes. So surveillance is essentially monitoring from the bottom up, the general population monitoring governments, functionaries of governments, and essentially making sure that there's no official misconduct. Surveillance is, of course, from the top down by governments or institutions. So I wanted to point out a few comments specifically regarding the Transhumanist Party. Hybrid Intermediate asked, what is Zoltan Istvan's association with the group? Bobby correctly responded, Zoltan ran for the presidency in 2016. Emil Holst said he was the director, actually the chairman before me, Gennady Stolyarov II. BJ says he's now an advisor for the party in terms of media relations. He's our political and media advisor. He sends us emails with some recommendations or some interesting paths or interesting materials to look at. He does not have a decision-making role currently, and he explicitly wanted it that way. Right now, he is running for governor of California under the Libertarian Party ticket, but he is essentially, he founded the Transhumanist Party, but he has essentially given it away to the transhumanist community. And so we in the transhumanist community are now running the party and setting up its infrastructure and growing its membership and trying to potentially scale it up into a more permanent self-sustaining organization. So that's the situation with Zoltan, and we are of course grateful to him for founding the party, for getting the media exposure that it received during his campaign, and for establishing a kind of storied history, because he's quite the adventurer. He's extremely hardworking. He had this Immortality bus tour. Much of it he coordinated himself, and he is very good at spreading ideas. Sometimes he's very controversial in how he does it. Sometimes he's very provocative, and deliberately so. He thinks it will get a lot of page views. And right now, under my leadership, we've tried to take that exposure and kind of render it a bit more, let's say, bounded or let's say palatable to the general public.
I was going to say the same thing. We're making it much more palatable for everyone to consume.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Zoltan can certainly present a strong dose of transhumanist medicine, and we're trying to present a kind of mild, gentle dose by which a lot of people might be willing to join our movement. But different approaches may have different effects and may succeed with some, fail with others. So we'll see what happens. So another question that I think is important: is there a convention dedicated solely to transhumanism? AJ Davis points out RadFest is coming up. I don't think it's specifically transhumanists, though. There will be a lot of transhumanists and life extensionists at RadFest, AI researchers as well, people who are generally interested in science. I would say there will also be a lot of religious individuals at RadFest, but anybody interested in living longer, anybody interested in kind of this idea of a broad coalition, a broad movement, would, I think, find RadFest beneficial. And of course, Aubrey de Grey, Bill Andrews, Ben Goertzel, Jose Cordero, Max Moore, Natasha Vita-Moore, luminaries within the transhumanist movement, researchers like Peter Voss, Michael Rose will be there. So I'm going to be there. The U.S. Transhumanist Party, as BJ pointed out, will have a presence. I will be moderating a panel that will include Zoltan, Jose Cordero, Ben Goertzel, Max Moore, Natasha Vita-Moore. I'll be giving a brief presentation on the Transhumanist Party. So then let's look at some other comments briefly. We will probably conclude within about 5 minutes. Harrison Bergman says, does government have a place in trying to improve the trust in media? I see this arguably as the largest problem. People are so uninformed because of the lack of trustworthy sources. Bobby, you said, I think we need to focus on making our political leaders more scientifically literate. I would say also, though, there's a danger in government directly influencing the media. Of course, there are government media channels like the BBC in the UK or National Public Radio in the US, and those have a role to play as long as they stay objective and factual and nonpartisan in essence. There is a danger in government organizations becoming arbiters of media, arbiters of truth, because the political process isn't free of its own biases or its own failings. So if the government is one player in a largely free market, a largely free ecosystem, that could bring some interesting perspectives or some facts to bear. But I don't think government should ever be in a position to restrict or censor or control what another outlet puts up, even if it's wrong, even if it's fake news. I think there need to be other strategies developed to counter that. Now, I will come back to other comments. I just want to acknowledge what's been posted. Super Thin Guy says, individualists can agree on common values like the Constitution of the United States. And I agree with that to the extent that common values or collective efforts or group efforts can lead to evidently recognized benefits. You can get individualists to cooperate. Emil Holst points out that in section 37 of our platform, the U.S. Transhumanist Party supports more proportional representation of the professions in government. And again, that actually is an idea that originates from Zoltan, and I like this idea. I think a lot of people misunderstood it because they thought, well, somehow the government should set rigid quotas for this is how many attorneys can be in elected office, this is how many engineers, how many teachers, etc. That's not at all what this means. It means that we should encourage more people who are not attorneys to participate in the political process and to contribute their views and insights, and we hope that will be reflected in the electoral results. But that doesn't require reforming the US Constitution or prohibiting people from serving in office. And Bobby, thank you for pointing out that you can become a member on the official U.S. Transhumanist Party website. Go to the top bar of links on the website, click on Become a Member, and you'll find the application. Yes.
Sorry. Also, in case you don't want to, in case someone doesn't actually even want to go to the page, you can also use the sign up button on our Facebook page if you're there, because that leads to the same application form for membership.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you, Martin. And we extensively publicize our application form on Facebook and Twitter and other social media. We will continue to do that. So Sylvester says, regarding overpopulation, we live in the universe and are not incarcerated on Earth, and that's correct. We have room to grow. We have room to expand. We want to be a multi-planetary species, in large part because that can rectify existential risk. Super Fin Guy along these lines says, yep, production increases as well. Humans are not like rats and rabbits. We don't only consume, we produce as well. And that is a great counter to the Malthusian argument with regard to fears of overpopulation. Open Source Temple notes, we did just help get an anti-nuclear treaty signed. Transhumanists punch above their weight. I like that, and I've actually observed that as well. Zoltan, during his campaign, was largely a one-man show, yet he was able to get so much media attention. He was able to achieve so much with his immortality bus, with his interviews, with his public protests, and he really laid the groundwork for this political party. And I think right now, by continuing these discussions, by being willing to be out there and advocate for these innovative, nonpartisan ways to improve the human condition, we are punching above our weight. Let's get a little bit more metaphorical weight, though, in terms of members, in terms of organizations, so that it's not just our personal efforts, it becomes more of a self-sustaining system. So let's see, we have a few more comments. Hybrid Intermediate says, are there any polls or metrics on the public understanding or opinions of the transhumanist movement? Bobby Ridge says, check out Sergio Canavero. I would also say, check out the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, or IEET. IEET has done some surveys in this regard over the past few years that I think are informative. Just a few more comments. Emil Holz says, morphological freedom is certainly important, especially if you want to avoid forcing things on people. Other important facets of transhumanism, in my opinion, are the admission of continual change, taking control of change, the valuing of intelligence and rationality for its own sake, but also for its opening of new experiences. Speaking of new experiences, Bobby Ridge asks, I wonder how a government will be run on Mars. Lucas Di Moveo says, pitching transhumanism on a Mars colony may be easier than on Earth. People would say that our push to the more alien forms of enhancement is unnecessary, but on a world with harsh environment, I think we'd be able to make a better case for augmentation. And yes, if one is faced with pressures for survival, there are these technologies that could be used. There's perhaps more of an incentive to use them. And I'll want to mention one more comment by Super Thin Guy. China, USA, and Russia all use cyber attacks, even on their own people. It's not only a Russian thing, and that is very true, and that's important to keep in mind. No technology, including technology of war, can be restricted to one particular country, and I think it's very important, in a sense, and I may be idealistic, some might call me naive for saying this, but the technology is available, but if there are damaging, destructive tactics that undermine human progress, undermine the fabric of our civilization, undermine our lives, we can make the decision to abstain from using them. We as individuals, of course, cannot control the US government. We can advocate, and we can personally say, if something is really nefarious to human well-being, we do not approve. We do not support these kinds of violations of individual lives and liberties. And one last question from Samael Quinn. Wouldn't transhumanism without far left politics lead to incredible inequality? I don't think so, in my view. I think any sort of ideological politics actually runs the risk of undermining the kind of broad-based progress that we've had as a society, precisely because we've had a diversity of individuals and institutions and pathways toward innovation. If you try to homogenize something under an ideological umbrella, what you're going to get is rigid repression. And we've seen far left politics fail time and again in the 20th century. Some leftists would say that, well, it wasn't pure socialism or pure communism, but attempts to implement them definitely unleashed certain nefarious, power-hungry individuals who did a lot of damage. So with that, and Dragil response to Samael Quinn, definitely not inequality is a fact of life. And to some extent, I would agree. You can't equalize everything by fiat or by force. You could have more equal distribution of resources and outcomes if people are more prosperous, at the very least in terms of what matters, which are human quality of life. But you have to start somewhere. No technology is going to be ubiquitously distributed, not even clean drinking water, but you have to start somewhere and spread it from there. And that's where incremental progress comes in. So those are my thoughts, but there were a lot of questions, a lot of areas. I just wanted to speed through them to make sure nobody was left out. But any of you, I'd like to ask for some closing statements or comments. DJ. Oh, Martin, I think you were muted.
No. I just, for a second, I thought it was interesting how suddenly it was like silent. Well, but closing statements. Completely improv here. I think, well, I think this, when it comes to the live Q&A here, I think this was really cool, despite us starting off with some technical difficulties, which I also actually think in a sense was interesting because it teaches us something we learn now. It's a first time we've done this, and then I get like, hey, this link isn't working, and then well, I got the solution. God, which of the two provided me the solution? Was it Bobby?
It was me.
Yeah, Scott. And provided solutions. So we've learned something new despite some hurdles. Yeah, and Gennady actually lost connection, but yeah, in the end we got here, and I think it's been a really cool experience, and I hope we can do this again.
I hope so too.
Yeah, like people asking questions, and also people being in dialogue with each other in the super chat. I think that is very important that we have this running dialogue. And of course, over time, people have new questions, as well as, I'm sure if we would do this again, there's going to be some questions that will be the same, and that I think that would be perfectly fine, because there will be new people who have entered the sphere, and yeah, we can't expect them to watch all the videos hours on end just to find one of the questions that has been answered previously. I think, yeah, we're making progress as a community, or as a movement, both in media and including things like this, as well as growing to become more mature in the sense of issues we're dealing with, issues, economic issues, when it comes to technology or genetics. And over time, with more people, more members, which is, yeah, we do need more members, because also more membership ensures that we have a more diverse set of perspectives. And I think that is, at least for me, is a very important factor, is different viewpoints ensure that we have more hopefully critical eyes looking at problems, and that way we can derive better possible solutions or standpoints on issues. And so, yeah, I hope that this will inspire some people to become members and become more participating with plank proposals and such. Anyways, yeah, that was my quick end of the live chat rant, I suppose.
Yes, well, thank you, Martin, and I completely agree. Go ahead, Bobby.
I was about to say, yeah, you know, transhumanism is happening now. You know, based off of Martin was saying, you know, he was having an issue, and you know, we were able to quickly, you know, fix it. But my laptop just died, so you know, we have a long way to go.
Yes, we have a long way to go for sustainable transhumanism because of these technical glitches. I agree.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, you know, it's just you know, a matter of convenience. You know, the quicker we can get this information to our brains and, you know, fix these problems, you know, will just become something in the subconscious almost. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. This is just the most important phenomena that's about to occur to our civilization, and so it's just, I think, incredibly important for everyone to learn about it and to start talking about it more.
Yes, absolutely. And BJ, any closing comments from you?
Yes. Well, just speaking as like the director of social media, I believe that we are at a very important time period, given just how many people are just being connected through internet, through social media. We're seeing billions of people being able to connect and to communicate, and this is going to help further the cause for transhumanism in such a large way, especially in social media. Now we're seeing some interesting developments for transhumanism. We're entering pop culture. We were mentioning about the ability to embrace humor and comedy with memes and what have you. Now there's a transhumanist memes group and page that is available for people to go to, and it's always very fun. I know the person personally. He's quite a hilarious person, but just that in terms of pop culture, that's going to take us a big way. We've got the transhuman tees for transhumanist merchandise. Social media is going to really help us enter that pop culture era, which is very important for millennials and Generation Z in so many different ways, and that alone is going to really bring us to the mainstream, I believe. So I'm quite grateful to be living in this time period, and quite grateful to be working with everyone here, and I can't wait to see what happens in the next few years.
Yes, likewise, we're very happy to have you alongside us and to have your advice and insight about how we can reach new demographics, especially younger generations on social media, because we do need more younger people interested in the transhumanist movement. I will say a few things in terms of the final comments that have been posted. Aileron asks, what advice would you give to someone who may be interested in starting a college transhumanist club affiliated with the official Transhumanist Party? We actually discussed that in the first segment of the Q&A, so please take a look at what was said, especially Bobby and Scott, who have very close familiarity with the campus atmosphere. Pesky Piggy says, blockchains can democratize. Yes, indeed, they can. And for those of you who want to find out more, read anything you can about blockchains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, cryptocurrencies, smart contracts, distributed autonomous organizations. You will see the potential for democratizing and securing transactions as well. And Emil Holst says, Zoltan laid the foundation for the movement when it comes to the Transhumanist Party, but not the movement as a whole. We shouldn't forget all the work in the 90s was done by people like Max Moore, etc. I have great respect for Max Moore and the extropian community, extropy being the principle that is the opposite of entropy, the increasing order and complexity and sophistication in the universe. So I do think we need to acknowledge our gratitude and our intellectual debt to our precursors in the transhumanist movement, Max Moore, Natasha Vita-Moore, FM 2030, Nick Bostrom, Anders Sandberg, so many others as well. So with that, thank you everybody. Thank you to our officers who participated. Thank you to those who posted comments in the chat. We were able to get to pretty much all of the comments, so I'm very pleased by that. And we hope to have this again next time. All right, have a good day.